Protection of the ocean for the last couple of decades has really focused on area-based protection. So how much of an area can we protect? What is the percentage? And over the last decade or so, we've been really focusing on protecting 30% of ocean and land by 2030. So 30 by 30, commonly known as 30 by 30. This is something that's been a big focus, area-based focused, but a lot of the times it's focused on the offshore area, not the nearshore area. And there's a new paper that was published by the Center of American Progress called the Nearshore Ocean Progress. It's a document that really highlights people who have been in communities who have been doing more nearshore local conservation. And that's going to be the subject of today's podcast, because we're going to be talking about why it's important to also focus on the nearshore as well as the offshore and some of the challenges, some of the successes that have come through it. And we're going to talk about some of the projects that have been going on in there and some of the reasons why we should go more locally these days and not always depend on federal support in that regard. So we're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. On today's episode, we got a special one for you today because we have guests from the Center of American Progress. We've had some of these people on before from this organization, like a think tank that talks a lot about ocean conservation and ocean protection. We're going to be going from 30 by 30 and into the nearshore and why protecting the nearshore is really important. We have Dr. Alia Hadiat, who's here to talk about the document, as well as Angelo Villagomez, friend of the podcast. And Alia is going to be here a number of times as well. I've invited her back a couple of times to talk to us in the future about not only nearshore, but stuff that's coming out of the Center of American Progress. You're going to love both of them and how they are talking about this stuff. We're going to talk a lot about why it's important to protect the nearshore, who's involved in protecting the nearshore, some of the challenges, some of the successes that we've seen before in protecting the nearshore, and a lot of other stuff that talks about, you know, new federal policies that are coming out in the US and why it's important to really focus on a local, but not always that's the reason. And so we've always had to focus on local. So we're going to be talking about a document that's been worked on for the last 2 years and where it's going to go in the future. So I want you to listen to this interview carefully. It's not going to be the last time we talk about this. Here is Dr. Alia Hadiat and Angelo Villagomez talking about Nearshore Ocean Progress. Enjoy the interview and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Alia. Hey, Angelo. Welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I almost messed it up there. Are you ready to talk about nearshore conservation?
Yeah, let's do it.
Why I'm here, man.
All right. I'm excited for this because this is something it's very close to my heart. It's very close to all of our hearts because when we look out at a lake or at the ocean, we look out a lot of times, not necessarily from a boat, but we look out from the coast. And you always want to see a nice coastline. You don't want to see green water. You don't want it to smell. You don't want to see pollution. You want to see beautiful water. But that hasn't been the focus for the last little bit. We've heard the 30 by 30 rule, protect 30% of the ocean and land by 2030. But we haven't really talked a lot about the coastal area, the nearshore area. And it seems to always get more into the deep, which is fine. Obviously, it's needed, but we always need to protect the nearshore where we are and where we have the most disturbance. So I'm looking forward to getting into this. Why such a shift? There's a new paper out that's on your website as well. People can download it and people can go in. Angela, from my understanding, you've been talking about it at conferences and so forth. So we're here to talk about it today. But before we do, I want to get to know Alia. This is the first time you're on the podcast. Angela's been on the podcast.
Yeah.
We'll get Angela to remind people who he is and what he does. But Alia, why don't you just let us know who you are and what you do?
All right. Thanks, Andrew. This is really exciting. Okay. This is, I think, my first podcast recording. So this is very new to me.
I love it. I love it. Very nice.
So I'm Ali Hidayat. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for American Progress with Angelo, working on conservation policy and ocean conservation. Before this, I actually got a PhD in ocean science in the impacts of climate on human health, and then ended up coming to policy after realizing that, hey, a lot of ocean problems are not science problems or research problems, they're policy problems. So a couple of years ago, made a pivot into ocean policy, moved to DC, and started here.
So I have to ask this question because my daughter is in grade 12. She is going to university for wildlife biology. She wants to be a biologist, and I've talked to her about policy and the importance of policy, but she's on like one track mind. I want to work with animals. I
Yeah.
want to work. So for you going into science, what was your like? What was this type of science were you doing? Were you doing science on specific animals, or was it like habitats or like oceanography? What was it about?
Yeah, no, I think that's sort of the I think being a marine biologist is a very glamorous type of position. I think like when you think of like kids, like what you want to do like as a child, I feel like it's marine biologist or astronaut. And I definitely caught that
Yes.
bug early, and that's what
Yes.
I imagined sort of a science and research career to be. And so during my PhD, I worked with zebrafish and looked at the
Okay.
effect of harmful algae, so red tide, and
Yeah.
other types of harmful algae on the brain. So it's still extremely fun. I love science,
Right.
but it's also really difficult work, and it's a lot of being able to troubleshoot and run into a wall again and again and again, and solve problems. And I think really enjoyed the research aspect of it. But again, as I mentioned, so much of the problems that we're facing right now are not research problems. They can't.
Yes.
Science can help us understand them, but we really need to bring people along and convince our policymakers and the
Mm-hmm.
communities that they represent to get on board with these solutions. So made a career pivot towards that. I think your daughter definitely like has like I love that interest. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
And just encouraging that hey, like the ocean and the animals that live in it and all the ecosystems are really exciting. Think about what are the most effective ways that we as people can help support them and keep them safe. And a lot of those solutions are policy solutions.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about harmful algal blooms too, right? It kind of
Mm-hmm.
hits you right in the face of what you need to do to get over that. And I find a lot of people who come up through the ranks of academia and they do marine biology or wildlife biology or more research on specific biology research questions pivot to policy. But was that a difficult thing for you to do? Like, you're always, when you're a kid, were you imagining always working with animals? And then as you mature through the academic process and you start to see, and you start to kind of get enlightened, I always called it when I started to get into conservation, was it a hard to pivot to that? Or was it something like, no, this is where I'm needed?
Yeah, I think it was definitely a learning process. I think I definitely had that image of my head of working on a boat, diving, being out in nature a lot more, and you don't realize that, hey, I'm a couple years into my PhD and I'm spending most of my time in a lab or working in Python. I think
Yeah.
that's not necessarily a bad thing because I think all of
Right.
those skills are really important, and that's
Yeah.
how real science works. But yeah, I think there's definitely a transition into what does this actually look like? What does a
Hmm.
career in science actually look like in the day to day? And that's different than what you might imagine as a kid.
Yeah.
And I think it's where from my position now, um, I think it took a little bit to see how I work in an office,
Hmm.
9 to 5
Yeah.
and in DC, far away from the ocean.
Yeah.
But I still think that the work that we do is really important, even if we're not
100%.
interacting with that every day. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely like a little bit of a switch to see
Yeah.
that type of job is still really important, even if it doesn't look like what you would imagine as like a wildlife biologist or marine
For
biologist.
sure. Well, and it's important work. Like it's probably one of the most important works we do as conservationists and as scientists. Really, is to make sure that we can enact the stuff that we identify as the problems in science to make sure we get it through. Angela, you've been doing this for quite some time now and working a lot of policy and working with different groups and working in offices and also being out and traveling the world and stuff. What are your when you first started your career? Let's go way back. You and I were about the same. We're the same age, going way back. I'm not sure if you remember when you first started and then coming into policy. Like, how do you find your career shifting and going into more? I mean, you were always into conservation, right? Like and so like where you're at now with some of the things that you're kind of leading and pushing in terms of policy. How do you find your work now, like at this stage of your career?
Well, I'm a large marine mammal. I don't know if you knew that. So, uh, to a certain degree, Alia does work with animals every single day. It's just it's in an office setting, and it's with a boat. But I also, when I was in high school, the only thing I thought I could be was a scientist. Like the other things just did not excite me.
Yeah.
And in the 1990s, the things that were offered to me were either chemistry, physics, or biology. You kind of had to pick between those three. And I started with physics, which I hated because it was all math.
Oh my God, physics.
And then I'm actually good at math. I just didn't want to do it for my entire life. But then I pivoted into biology, and that's kind of where I discovered conservation, because I learned that you could spend your entire life studying beetles, naming them and learning what they do, but then a multinational corporation could come in and cut down your rainforest over the weekend,
Yep.
and your life's work would be over. So
Yep.
that kind of made 19-year-old me angry. And I started knocking on doors for political campaigns in college. So I've been doing sort of like the political leaning type stuff, like right out the gate. And my first job after college, my first real job, because I spent a couple of years waiting tables, because sometimes you don't get that great job right away. But I worked for 2 years for the League of Conservation Voters, and we were knocking on doors and gathering petitions and talking about, this was in Florida, so we were talking about offshore drilling, which we're still talking about offshore drilling today, which is an issue that never seems to go away, and also water quality issues. Again, incredibly important for communities around the world.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's it's important. Policy is important. We need to, not only put through policy and inform people, but inform the people about policy, which I love, which is you guys are on this podcast today to talk about, how policies need to switch. Now, for the last, I would say, good like 5-6 years even, we've been really focusing on 30 by 30, so protecting 30% of water and 30% of land by 2030. Regimes shift, administration shift, they change. There's still a focus on that, still talking about that. Whether we're going to be able to get that from an international perspective, like a worldwide perspective, that's still to be debated. And it seems like as we get closer and closer to the 2030 time, it doesn't look like we'll get there, but we'll get better than what we were before. But now with everything that's happening in the U.S., there's a shift away from conservation. Angelo, where is the 30 by 30 sort of, I guess, not activism or advocacy, but they're trying to push 30 by 30. Where is that at right now in the U.S. with these changes with the government?
So first of all, I think you're absolutely right. This shift in conservation priorities has always happened, for the last 100 years. Back in Teddy Roosevelt days, and he was the American president in the early 1900s, he created all these national parks because he wanted scenic landscapes. And we still love scenic landscapes, and we love to go there and take our Instagram photos. But it's not the driving reason why we do conservation today. And the conservation movement has always changed every 10 or 15 years. With Rachel Carson's book in the 1960s, Aldo Leopold before that. And then like when you and I were growing up, it was all about save the whales, close the ozone, save the ozone layer, save the rainforest. And then, climate change kind of became much more important in the 2000s. And then after 2020, it was equity and justice because of the murder of George Floyd. So before I even answer that question, this change is good. And the conservation community has talked about these area targets for literally decades. If you look back at David Brower, who led the Sierra Club in the 1960s and 70s, the Sierra Club was talking about protecting 10% of the land back in the 1960s. So it's not a new idea, but what changed is it became the bumper sticker slogan for about, I would say about 10 years. Because when I worked for the Pew Charitable Trusts in 2016, we were actually the ones who sponsored that resolution at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So I helped draft that resolution and recruited the other 20 sponsors, negotiated the language. So like for a good decade, 30 by 30 has been it. And if you browse people's websites today, they talk about we have to achieve 30 by 30, which is 30% of lands and oceans by 2030. But if you really start to pick apart some of these, like the arguments for the arguments for 30 by 30, at its core, what it really means is we need more conservation, we need better conservation, and we need faster conservation. And then I would add in there, in the last 5 years, we need more equitable and just conservation. So I don't think that 30 by 30 is coming to an end. I think we're going to continue to use area targets as a metric. you're still going to want to know. We're going to talk about kelp.
Right.
You're going to want to know how much kelp is protected, because that's going to help managers with their decisions on how to manage it. But it's not going to be the goal. It's not going to be the thing at the top of your paper. And the funny thing about this paper that we just proposed is that we haven't come to agreement around what that thing is. Like there's all of these targets end in 2030, and in 2031 we're going to need a new bumper sticker. And I don't think there's agreement yet as to what that bumper sticker is. And I think different organizations are kind of hovering around what it might be. The World Wildlife Foundation talks about nature positive. I just went to the Tiaki Moana conference. So Tiaki means sort of like guardian, and then Moana means ocean. So I think there's this combination of people and nature and equity and justice, but also strong and good conservation that is well designed and implemented. And I've literally just spent like several minutes talking about what could go down on a bumper sticker. And some brilliant person is going to offer something at some moment, and that's what the 2030s will be about. And so that's what I hope this report helps begin that discussion of, 30 by 30 has been great. It's raised ambitions. Like more money is pouring into the conservation movement than ever. It's inspired people. You've got presidents. Joe Biden talked about 30 by 30 in his State of the Union. When has that ever happened in the United States?
True.
Yeah, so like it's been incredibly great, but what have we learned? Most of the science for 30 by 30 is from the 2000s and the 2010s, and it doesn't really take into account everything that happened after George Floyd. So, so much science and so much learning and experience has happened in the 2020s. How do we take that and come up with the next thing? And that's the question that we're asking.
And I think it's great, because I think, one of the concerns I remember when all this was happening, when 3030 was being proposed, I remember here in Canada, the federal government under Trudeau was like, we're going to increase ours. I think we were at like 1% at the time, or 1.5%. And he increased it, or his government increased it to like 15% within a few years. The big worry was like, are these going to be like properly protected, or are they just picking random areas like the low hanging fruit? Like, we picked Arctic areas, which, Angelo, you've talked about this on huge stages before, where we tend to go to indigenous places to be able to protect those places because there tend to be larger coverages and you tend to get more area. But are they really, talking about justice and equitability in their equity in these areas, are they really where we need to focus, or do we need to focus in areas where there's a little bit more controversy, a little bit more action in terms of disturbance, in terms of really where we need to get that conservation? So I really like that sort of the evolution of conservation, how it's going. It's not to say that 30 by 30 sucked and it didn't do anything. It obviously did a lot, and it made us learn a lot. And then with all these things that happened, such as, the unfortunate events of what happened to George Floyd, and then what happened after that, we started to really push on this. Now, I have to ask this. I'm in Canada. I'm here sitting above you guys geographically and looking down. And the definite focus has been, when we look at conservation is justice, equity, inclusion. But then, of course, this administration comes in the U.S. and says, yeah, well, DEI is gone. It's over. Like everybody, and here in Canada, it's kind of resonated with a lot of people. It's like, we're not doing that anymore. This is all BS, and we're not doing this. But we've really found a good thing in conservation. Like, obviously, I'm not saying that DEI was worth nothing. It's still there. It's not disappeared just because one person says so or a couple people say so, and it's still needed. It's still good for us in conservation, especially because now we're really starting to dive into community management and so forth. How is that being met in the conservation community when you have, and Ali, maybe you can comment on this, and when you have such of like a controversy here, or like a conflict between what the federal government is saying and then what the conservation community is saying, and what we need to move forward with?
Yeah, that's a really good question, a really hard question. I'd say that one of the cool things about the nearshore framework and the concept of moving nearshore in general with our conservation focus is that It's like you mentioned, a really fundamental shift in what our goals are for conservation, what it's aiming to do. I think to go back to what Angela was saying, there was a time period, Teddy Roosevelt, where a lot of the focus was on putting nature and protecting it and safeguarding it away from where people are, and nature is something that you go and visit. And today, with this report, we want to really encourage people to see nature as something that works for people, works for coastal communities, in addition to ecosystems. So this means helping protect coastal communities from effects of storms and flooding, helping provide livelihoods, economic benefits, important part of culture or religious connection for some communities. All of these are aspects of nature and of coastal communities that are really important. And I think our focus as conservation professionals should focus there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one nice thing about moving nearshore away from those really large pelagic protected areas is that you're putting nature within reach of people and putting your protections where people can see them and experience them and benefit from them. So even though for my frustration, a lot of people are walking away from DEI promises and interest in equity, I think that there's still a lot of benefits that can be provided to communities that have historically not been able to access nature, who have not been able to benefit from nature, by just shifting our focus to conservation. So while I would love to be in a place where there's a strong federal commitment to DEI and saying those principles out loud, I think one of the benefits of shifting this focus is that there's going to be benefits for sort of underserved communities, even if you have to fly under the radar a little bit.
Does it also help that that when you start to talk about nearshore, you're starting to talk about state jurisdiction instead of federal jurisdiction? And so certain states, I'm not saying all states, but certain states might be more likable and more agreeable with this type of equity, justice, sort of DEI type of work that will really focus conservation in the nearshore. Angela, do you find that is a benefit in this situation when the federal government may not be willing to work as hard to do these conservation goals?
I mean, the real answer is, we were going to do this regardless who won the presidential election. Trump didn't win, and we said, oh, we need to pivot to nearshore. We've been working on this for 2 years. Now, it would have looked slightly different under Biden. And Trump has ended 30 by 30. So let's not kid ourselves.
That's true.
30 by 30 is over at the federal level. And then many DEI initiatives, while may not overturned, are under attack. By Trump. And, Trump is a guy who loves to build walls. He loves to build walls between peoples. And right now, what they're doing is they're building walls to keep women and people of color who are qualified to participate in these positions. And he's building those walls back up. And America has always had those walls. We've only allowed white women to vote in this country for 100 years. America turns 250 next year, so that's insane. So for 150 years, white women were not allowed to vote, and then only for 100 years. So less than half the time that this country has been a country. Indigenous peoples have been able to vote for less than 100 years. The territories are still considered savages, officially, by the Supreme Court. So there's. The Biden administration had done a lot of work to break down the barriers that keep qualified people out of positions. And you can look at people like Secretary Deb Haaland. Change the Department of Interior, change the focus, included tribes at a degree that had never, ever even been considered, really change the entire paradigm. And when these walls go up that keep out qualified people who care about these issues, these positions are being filled by people who are unqualified, who have gotten the jobs because of who they know, not because of what they know. And so that's the whole DEI thing with the Trump administration. And so it is going to be a struggle for the next couple of years because if I go to the government, with the federal government, with an issue, is anybody still even going to work there? With these Doge cuts that are happening, I think NOAA has already lost 28% of its staff that worked there in December. And then the number for the Department of Interior was in my head. but in the last 60 seconds, it departed my head. But it's in the double digits, and
Yeah,
it's
it's
quite
insane.
high. And they're not done. Like they're more cuts are coming to our federal government. And you just think about the people who work there and the literal the centuries of experience that these hundreds and thousands of people who had. And like, just imagine you worked at a restaurant. If you worked at a restaurant and, so what they've already done is they've fired all of the young waiters and all of the young cooks who were doing, chopping the vegetables, right? Or they're doing the side work. And then they forced all of your senior waiters, your senior managers, and your senior cooks to retire. Who's left? And what has that done to the culture of your business, right? These people, if you want to get good stuff out of your employees, they have to like to work there. And so just sort of like at all angles, conservation is being attacked. The federal government is cutting the funding, they're cutting the staff, they're destroying the culture of some of these places, they're deleting databases of information, just wiping it off so that people can't even access this kind of stuff. So we have to work with the states because of Trump.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do think a lot of work had already gone into thinking about this.
Right.
And, hopefully Trump is just a temporary thing, 3 to 4 years. But I do think this will be a big part of the conversation in the 2030s of like, how do we capture the biodiversity that is near shore, the cultures that have emerged and live with this nature near shore. And Lenfest has this thing called the Biodiversity Dialogue. So they did with Smithsonian, and they published a paper last year and found that if you look at the United States network of marine protected areas and compared it to where all of the biodiversity is, there's almost a complete mismatch.
Oh yeah.
And that paper was published a year ago, and again, several years of work went into getting it to publication. So there's a reality that Trump is president, and he's like just undermining everything that we care about. At the same time, this work has been ongoing for many, many years now. And I think the thing to take home for your listeners is that America is being forced to deal with this 5 years ahead of everybody else. So what lessons are we going to learn, and what lessons can we share with the rest of the world? Because it was forced on us, whereas the rest of the world is going to hopefully be able to deal with it more on their own timelines. But this is the thing. This is something that the conservation movement has been discussing for many, many years. And what we've done, and we've been on the phone for like 25 minutes and we haven't even talked about the report yet. So let's go ahead and start that recording right now. Everything else, this was all pretext. Is there's all of this work happening all across the country in the United States. And what we've tried to do is just highlight some of that to give people some hope. Yeah. Because it's not over. Ocean conservation has not ended. There's still thousands of people out there doing great work. And here are some examples. And what can we learn from each other? And what can we do on what's working well on the West Coast? How can we adopt it on the East Coast and vice versa? And that's basically what we hope the crux of this report will contribute to the national conversation.
Yeah. Like how did this all begin with this nearshore focus? Like, Angela mentioned you guys have been working on this for 2 years. Where did it all start from and getting into that purpose?
Yeah, I'd say to answer that and to build off what Angela was saying, there's so much great work already being done at the state and local level that doesn't rise to the same level of attention as some of the federal sort of large and more glamorous conservation actions. And we thought that was a challenge, one, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to learn from these successes that are happening at a smaller level. And I think there's a lot of important lessons that can be learned from there. So I think that the desire to, one, not reinvent the wheel and to take those lessons and try and replicate them on a larger scale and figure out how we can better support states and local organizations in this really great conservation work that they're doing was the motivating factor. And at the same time, recognizing that a lot of this work is paving the way for how we can build on top of 30 by 30. So like we discussed earlier, there are blind. 30 by 30 does a lot of things well. It does have some blind spots. And a lot of those blind spots are in the nearshore areas that are within state jurisdictions. So I think, as Angelo said, even if Trump was not elected president, those waters are still within the control of states, and you have to work with them and have to understand how things are working at a much smaller level in order to be able to functionally do conservation at that scale. So I think we always knew that that was the direction that we had to head in. I think the Trump presidency really just put some of that into focus. And I was trying to focus, prep for this answer as Angela was talking, but also getting mad as you started going into the Doge cuts and all this, because there's a real human impact of a lot of this. And as we were saying, hey, these states are doing great things and they can continue to do leadership in a time when there isn't a lot of federal leadership at this level. There's still going to need a lot of help. And so many of these projects rely on federal funding. They rely on support from NOAA staff who are now getting cut. And as well as at the same time as we can point to this as a place for hope and a place where leadership can still happen, I think it's also important to step back and see that even when you're looking at the state level, it's hard to avoid some of these federal impacts. And they really ripple throughout this entire ecosystem.
For sure, absolutely. It's something that obviously has to get addressed, but to keep up with that hope of seeing areas conserved in the near shore, how is it different from the area-based conservation targets that we looked at with the 30 by 30? Are we still not trying to do 30% of the near shore, or is there just no number? It's just whatever that local community wants to protect as what they define as what is important to them.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that when you move near shore, you run into a whole different set of challenges, right? Instead of looking at sort of these pelagic remote areas, you're looking at, for example, we talk about the Chesapeake Bay in our report, which is 18 million people living in a much smaller area. And so you have to contend with sort of the political context, the social context, and a lot of those impacts. So a lot of the strategy that works for larger, sort of more pelagic areas won't work when you move near shore. So you have this sort of challenge, but also a new opportunity to think of new metrics outside of acreage alone. So that's, we highlighted a couple of different things, or a lot of different things in this report. But that looks like water quality measures, looks like individual, let's say, looking at the amount of certain habitat forming species like oysters or seagrass, really trying to get more creative with the metrics that we use. And part of that will be community input. So for example, how much of, for example, if we restore this seagrass meadow or the seagrass bed, how does that impact the production of crabs or fish that can then be caught by fishermen and sold off and support local economies? So there's definitely an interplay between coastal conservation and local communities. And I think the metrics will have to shift in order to sort of incorporate a larger set of benefits.
I think what's great too, when you're looking at nearshore, and a community that's been there for a long time compared to offshore, you may not have the history of what it looked like before you started to conserve it. You might have a little bit from say users that were using it, whether it be fishing or oil and gas or whatever, but near here you have a coastal community that's probably been there for centuries, if not more, knowing what was there before, why it disappeared. And so the benefits of having that seagrass meadow, that kelp forest, or that oyster bed, and knowing that, hey, there could be, since those stories are still around and people know that history, there's a reason to put this back, not only from an ecological perspective, but also from a cultural perspective. But when you have people in there tends to be a little bit more conflict in terms of how things should be done. So how, with some of the examples that they've talked, that the report talked about, there was the Hawaii's, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this, Halamua Marine Initiative, and then there's a Florida Tract Rescue Project, Guam Green Growth Initiative. Is there a lot when it comes to nearshore where more people are active and responding to it? Is there a lot more conflict at the beginning of this process when you bring all the stakeholders together, or did that happen with some of these projects? Maybe just highlighting one or two if you know more of that.
I mean, I guess like the big question is like we're asking the conservation community to ask themselves two questions. The first question is, what do you mean by conservation success? And Alia brought up this idea of like just different metrics. And for a long time, success meant, is it big? And like I was a funder for a couple of years, and one of the most important metrics was, is it big?
Right.
And given the opportunity between funding something that was big and meaningless, meaning like there were no protections, or tiny but amazing, most of the funders would pick big and meaningless. I have real world experience with that. The second question that we're asking them to re-examine is, who is this success for? Right. So I was on a paper with Beth Pike last year. We looked at the 100 largest marine protected areas around the world, and 2/3 of the highly to fully marine protected areas are in overseas territories. In unpolite company, we call these colonies. And so most of the progress towards 30 by 30 has been in these colonies where the people are disenfranchised. Not disenfranchised meaning like you're left out, disenfranchised meaning you don't vote. Like you don't have a vote on this. You don't vote for your president. You don't vote for the people who represent you in the national government. And most of the protected areas around the world, the big ones that contribute to the coverage, for the most part, have benefited the people in the capitals who ask for these things, the people who fly to international conferences to gloat about some of these big changes, and then the burden of managing and living with these outcomes are the people in these overseas territories, or as I refer to them as colonies. And I'm one of those people, and I was on the front lines of that movement. And I think a number of people, going back more than 10 years, have asked the question, is that ethical? And then, you point out, do we even know what's happening offshore? In a certain degree, we kind of do. The University of British Columbia has the Sea Around Us project, where they have most of the fishing capture data from the last 60 or 70 years.
Right.
So we actually know what type of fishing was taking place in most places around the world. And oh my gosh, I'm going to blank on this scientist's name. It's Veronica something, but she was at UBC under Daniel Pauly, and she compared some of the fisheries data to when the EEZs, the exclusive economic zones, were designated versus to when the marine protected areas were designated. It actually, for a lot of these overseas territories, in the 1980s and 1990s, international waters started at 3 miles. Right. So like around Guam, international waters started at 3 miles. And then when Ronald Reagan declared the EEZ, it went out to 200 miles, which you can't even see because the screen isn't that big. But there used to be lots of Japanese squid fishing happening in the Marianas. But when the U.S. claimed that waters, all of the fishing was pushed out. And then 10, 20, 30 years later, when France had done the same thing, and England and New Zealand and Mexico had done the same thing, these politicians came along and said, oh, here's an area with no fishing. This is a place that's good for a protected area. Now, in the United States, this actually models the same story on land. In the 1920s, President Jackson forced all of the native people living on the East Coast of the United States to move to Oklahoma. That's, lots of American lands were people were forcibly removed in the 1820s. But then by the time John Muir came around in the 1870s and 1890s, these places were wilderness.
Right.
Nobody lives there. It's empty. And that's how we got most of our national parks, is that, these places where nobody lived suddenly got protected. But, the reality is that something earlier had happened to force out the human connection. And, there just there aren't many places in the world where you can create large land protected areas because people live there now, and you would never think about some people do think about it, but it's considered unethical to do that.
Yeah.
And on the water, a lot of people don't know that the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea was ratified in 1994. Um, I was in high school in 1994, but a lot of the people I work with were not alive in 1994. So, they just kind of assume that, and maybe somebody on this call, they
Don't call me out, Angelo.
yeah, there's just an assumption that the ocean has always kind of been managed like this, but
Right.
the truth of it is that it wasn't.
Yeah.
And other older cultures, and again, you and I, American Canadian, we have a very American Canadian worldview. Other cultures like France and Japan that have lived in landscapes for a lot longer have a very different relationship with nature when it comes to nature where people are, right? You have the French countryside, which, protects nature to a certain degree in a certain way. You have the Japanese park, like Ken Rokuen is the great Japanese park, if the listeners know anything about that. And America is a young country. We're still kind of figuring some of these things out. And just as we've learned the importance of green spaces in cities, this is a report where we're saying blue spaces on coastal areas are also critically important. And just as we had a period of time where we created these large protected areas on land, it just, logically, it makes sense that there would be a period of time where we created these large blue spaces on the water. And for many years, I've postulated that moment is coming to an end.
Right.
We've run out of colonies to protect. They're all protected. So now we need to work on blue spaces in coastal areas.
How much more challenge? Go ahead, please.
I would love to jump in on that. I think Angelo did a really good job of laying out what sort of the status quo was, or the history of this very top-down approach to conservation. So to flip it, one thing that we're really excited is the fact that moving near shore, it has to necessarily be bottom up. We talked to, I think, over 50, or we conducted 50. We collected 50 survey responses or interviews in the process of making this report. And one thing that was sort of a repeated theme throughout is that these projects are successful because they have buy-in from the community. And there's no way to be successful if you don't have that.
For sure.
One, because that's what you're asking people to participate in the community and change their behavior, but also because people in the community know those ecosystems the best, as you said. Because they're near it and experiencing it, they have a better sense of what will work and what won't. So I think that's one of the cool things, that it's very democratic. And one of the things that gave me hope in doing this report is that even red states, blue states, when you're working at a more local level and people can experience, hey, if we preserve this ecosystem, this means a better catch for me, or better tourism, or I can enjoy this beach better. It's very personal to people, and they're more willing to engage in those behavior changes. So I think in addition to what you said about people can see sort of the historical record about what that habitat used to be, they know why it's important, and that gives them like a personal stake about why they should be invested. So I think rather than this really top down, like coming from, as Angela said, the capitals, people say, hey, we're going to draw this line and this is our new protected area, stay out of it. This is a strategy that says, hey, we understand that you live here and have lived here for a long time, have experienced this ecosystem and its benefits to you. How can we build on that knowledge in order to create a conservation strategy that works better? And that's definitely hard, because it's going to change a lot between different ecosystems. If you move between different towns or cities or states, it's all going to look a little bit different. But I think one thing that we really try to stress is that you really need to look towards those local leaders in order to have any chance of success there.
And do you find too, as you get sort of lower, more to that local level, you get more into who really loves the environment, who really stands up for their environment, and less of that political divide. You start to strip the parties down a little bit into just I live 20 minutes a walk from my lakefront, like Lake Ontario. I love going down by the lake. Like that's something that I would love to make sure that that's protected and that the water quality stays nicely. And it's more of a political situation that you would get at the federal level, and more of a, I really want to preserve this place because it's near and dear to me. I see it every day, whereas I may not see something offshore. So it's just a little bit more. You get really down into people's personal choices in terms of what they want to protect and what they love to see. If they live along a coastline, they're going to want to go by the coastline. There's always a waterfront of some sort, and they want to protect that area so that they get to enjoy it and their kids get to enjoy it as well, right? Angela, it looks like you have something to
Yeah,
you
no,
want to say.
yes, but you don't want to be too idealistic about all of this.
Okay.
There's always that guy who sees the beautiful state park and is like, that'd be a great place to put my house.
Yeah,
Um,
true.
So yeah, I think all politics are local, and talking about these things, people are invested in some of these these nearshore places. Like it's, as you said, it's their backyard, it's their home. Um, but yeah, I don't want to be too idealistic about how difficult or how easy this is.
Mm-hmm.
If governments listen to science, none of us would have jobs. We have to force governments to listen to
Yeah.
science, and that's never been truer than today.
Well, and with nearshore conservation, to get people to speak up about a specific item, is it like so? I guess sorry, taking a step back just for nearshore conservation, is it better to is it better to, are there frameworks involved in this? Is there like a national framework that can be put in like on the west coast of say the US or the east coast of the US or Alaska or Hawaii? Is there a general framework that's followed, or is it very much piecemeal to everybody's trying to figure out their own way of doing nearshore conservation? Who wants to answer? Alia, maybe?
I can give it a stab. I think as Angela mentioned, we highlight a ton of different examples of good policy across 6 different habitats across the US. And I'd say it is definitely more piecemeal. It varies based on habitat. Every state is doing its own thing. There is some really cool regional efforts where multiple different states or localities are working together. And
Yeah.
I think that those types of efforts tend to be pretty successful because you have coordination across multiple different bodies. But yeah, I think that's one of the challenges is when you're working on a local level and focusing on these really hyper local issues, how do you make sure that you still have a sense of the larger picture, that people are working together and coordinating efforts, coordinating funding and all of that. As far as regulations go too, every state does something different when it comes to each of these habitats, and that can be challenging to understand. I think just for us, honestly, just to go through and understand the landscape of what exists out there, because it can vary a lot between state to state. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to coordinate between these different groups. And honestly, this is where having some sort of federal overarching structure would be really helpful to help make sure that everyone's on the same page and can learn from each other.
That's why some of these federal interventions can seem so exciting for funders, though, because they love to say the word scalable, and it's scalable. And for coastal,
the buzzword.
none of this is scalable. Like just because something
Yeah.
works, you pass a law in Florida and it works great, does not mean it's going to work in Washington. And just because people in Washington support something does not mean that people in Oregon are going to support something. And I love quoting one of my favorite scientists is Dr. Asha DeVos from Sri Lanka. She's a whale scientist. And she says, every coastline needs a hero. And the world's largest habitat is going to need the world's largest team. And so rather than thinking about scaling the protections, we need to think about scaling the workforce, because we have to find we have to find the person who's going to be the champion for this. And we need a violet sage walker for every 50 kilometers of the East Coast, and every 50 kilometers of the West Coast. We're not going to, and Violet Sage Walker just won an award last night. So did, Don and Chair Mallory. We need more ocean heroes. And that's where the investment has to happen. I was just at a conference in Vancouver where several of the people on the stage were saying, one of the lessons that they've learned in the last 3 years is that we've not invested in power building and grassroots organizing in the ocean community. And, so much of our work is still this parachute approach where we're like, look, we have science, we know what's best for you. And there's just been not a lot of investment in local communities. So or even if it's like an individual in a community who will then lead
Yeah,
that
for
community
sure.
for their entire lives. And the ocean community doesn't have a pipeline to support people through their entire career. We've got lots of things to bring people in early, like you get Earth Echo,
Yep.
or Sustainable Ocean Alliance and Heirs to Our Ocean. Like there's a lot of things for a junior person to
Yep.
do for a year or two, and you go in and you get that when you're 22, 23, 24. But what happens when you're 29? Like what's that next step, and how do I keep you in the movement? Because like when you're in your late 20s and you're early 30s, like you're gonna learn a lot of lessons then. So like how do we bridge you from junior person to senior person?
Yeah.
And just there's not a lot of money to go around. Um, there's a lot of money in other ocean spaces. There's a lot of money for sustainable fishing. There's a lot of money for blue economy. But for these marine protected area issues, these conservation issues, the priority is always very low and there's always less money. And so we need more money.
We need more money, but I also find we need more money directed at these individuals too. And I think that's I've seen that happen for a long time. It used to be that way where like funders would invest in the organization to invest in their people, and you would actually see people with those organizations longer term. What I've seen over the last 20 years, like in my career, is that funders are only saying you can only put 30% to overhead or to pay for the people, which is great for early career scientists who are coming out and conservationists who are coming out. But then after that, when they want to grow and they want to have a family and they want to have, a house and live like everybody else, we can't pay you more because the funding won't allow it to happen. I feel like there needs to be a switch in this paradigm to just be like, we need to invest more in the people, not only like individually, but also within the organization so that we can grow that experience and get better and better and better as we go through.
Yeah.
I would love to see that. I think that's a really great point, Angela. And I don't know how it's done. I really don't know how it's done. If that's done at like a community level, where it's like, if you see someone who's willing to stand up, does the community back it financially, or does was it the region or county or however? How would you propose, either of you propose that to be done?
Yeah, I was a beneficiary of that, to be honest. So back when I was living on the island, the Nature Conservancy had this thing called Micronesians and Island Conservation, and TNC was led by Bill Rayner, who passed away several years ago. But Bill was a mentor to a dozen of us, of the Micronesian conservation leaders, and TNC created learning spaces for us where we could learn from one another and advance our career and gain skills. So it's not that nobody is doing this,
Right?
It's like there are. I love the SACNAS conference, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. If you are under 30 and you are a person of color, get your butt to SACNAS, because it'll be one of the most fulfilling conferences that you'll ever see. Again, it can be a little bit expensive, right? So
Yep.
I admit that. I find that IMCC is also one of the better spaces for helping early career folks sort of learn skills to keep them in the space and feel wanted and needed. So it's not that none of this is happening, but when the millions and the billions are discussed, a lot of times, the people themselves are left out.
Yeah. So we're talking about nearshore, and although that's been going on for a while, and these projects have been going on for a while, with this paper that's coming out, where does this paper want to see nearshore conservation go over the next 5 to 10 years, in terms of the focus of this? How is that going to proceed, or where do you see it going in the future, or hope to see it go in the future?
I think there's a lot of different ways. And I think, as Angela mentioned, we are still looking for that bumper sticker that will replace 30 by 30. It's hard to wrap up into one concise measure. And I think you can tell we had a hard time summing it up because our report has like 50 different recommendations and places that this could go. But I think to sum up into a couple of big themes, that looking for metrics outside of acreage. So again, looking towards how can we make this ecosystem work better for people as well as preserve biodiversity. And then in order to support that, have that long-term funding and monitoring, and really invest in a place rather than sort of setting it and walking away. How do we continue to invest in making sure that this conservation succeeds? Because conservation and restoration happens across a decade or more rather than just a couple of years. And what we found is that you really have to keep investing in a community to make sure that succeeds. And then I guess if I had to pick a third thing also, looking to things in order to ensure success in ocean conservation, making sure that we're looking towards what's happening on land first, because we know that there are a lot of things that even if you draw sort of a marine protected area, there are things outside of those boundaries that can really impact the success of it.
For sure.
So looking at things like development, pollution, climate change, all of those really diffuse effects, which really have an impact on biodiversity and start outside of those boundaries. So try and rethinking conservation to look at those stressors in addition to what's happening in that sort of local area.
Well, it's also it's interesting when you get to the near shore, because it's like, how far inland do you go? You know, like, like we went through an exercise here in the Great Lakes when I was working for Environment Canada, now Environment Canada Climate Change, but we were asking that question all the time. It's like, where do we go? How far up the watershed do you go where it's going to impact the coastline? You know, like
absolutely.
Where do you get into land management as well as nearshore management? Because there's that intersection, it's so highly influenced. It's so connected. It's like how far up you go, and then like it was almost like you needed to do as at the top of the watershed, and then you look down, and that's what it is. Or because they're all delineated, like there's a lot of research within that. It's just how, but there's not a lot of research on how it interacts with the bigger body of water, whether it be a lake or in this situation an ocean, and how that's managed. Because now you're looking at, you know, realms that we never really we always treated separately. And I think that's one of the challenges that can be overcome. It could be addressed. It's just that you need to bring other people in that are not just ocean people, but other people in that are land people, not only from a science perspective, but from a steward perspective, right? So there's a lot of things that complicate the process, but make it better in the end, and probably better for ocean just in general, right?
There's a lot of siloing between the sort of the land and ocean world, and I think it makes it harder to do the things that we need to do. One of our sort of like kill your darlings moments for this report is we originally had included, we would love to include salmon and rivers and freshwater impacts as well. And so we ended up saving that for something else, maybe down the line. But it was difficult because everything that happens in freshwater and rivers and streams ends up affecting the ocean. So it's all very sort of a gray area in terms of where does that conservation focus stop. And so I think we try and make a note of that in this report. And again, say that if you really care about what happens in the ocean, you need to care about what happens on land. But again, it's a difficult space because the focus is so large.
Yeah. But I think also too, you can get probably more people involved because they can actually see the results. It's almost like a beach cleanup, right? When you do a beach cleanup, you get a community together, you can clean up the beaches, you see that the beaches are clean, people want to go more on the beach, and as they get more connected, I feel almost the same way with a nearshore habitat. You can get people from land going towards the coast, maybe do a cleanup in a wetland or something like that, and really understand and get to know that area that they may not have gotten to know in the first place. Like, I live in a temperate area. Mudflats are key ecosystems, but nobody wants to go play in the mud anymore. They don't want to get dirty, when that's probably one of the best places to go, or salt marsh and things like that. It could be hard to get into, but once you start getting kids in and youth programs and stuff like that, and even adult programs to get into there, then maybe it can help. So there could be a way like to really get more people interested because they can see the results based on this. But like, you know, for if someone is listening to this right now and they're in a coastal community and they want to be that champion, you know, whether it be now or in the future, they want to build up to that. How can like a document like this, or what comes out of the documents like this nearshore conservation document, that can help those communities and people who want to become that ocean, that nearshore champion?
You know, every coastline needs a hero, man. I mean, you as individuals, we are more effective in the place we live than these other places that are far off. And not only that, you have expertise and relationships that an outsider will never have. And so I think for this report, it's meant as a resource
Yep.
of, we kind of, the way there's 6 habitats in the paper, and we considered others, but they didn't make the report.
I didn't see mudflats in that report.
Yeah, we
Angelo.
failed.
Didn't see mudflats in that.
We'll do a separate report on mangroves, mudflats, and salmon.
There you go.
But we landed on these 6 because there's people all around the country who care about kelp. And like
sure.
kelp is just a great example. The largest habitat for kelp is in the United States and Canada. So if we protect the kelp in Canada and the United States, it is going to be a globally significant action. But only 2% of U.S. waters have kelp. And it tends to be near shore. Like it tends to be a water shallower than 130 feet, which is like 30 meters. And so it's just, if your metric of success is 30 by 30, you don't capture kelp, right? It's just, it's not a part of it. So we're trying to change a narrative, and just showing that there's all this great work happening all across the country. So if you're just a person living somewhere, you know what you care about. You know if there's coral reefs off your water. You know if it's kelp. You know if you're surrounded by seagrasses, because all across the country, these habitats dominate in different places. Yeah, and this is a resource for you to understand some of the more successful interventions that are happening all across the United States. It can be a starting place for you. So maybe you're in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And they have a really good watershed plan, but other things that you could learn from Guam, like how what are the things that they can learn from one another. But like the big picture is we're trying to change this narrative of, nobody has ever stood in front of the Grand Canyon and said, I bet you didn't know how many acres are in here. It's the Grand freaking Canyon.
It's grand. That's the area of grand. It's grand.
It creates, I think Ron Swanson said crying is allowed when looking at the Grand. I didn't get this exactly right. This is crying is allowed when you're in front of the Grand Canyon, because it's a magnificent, beautiful place.
No doubt.
And I feel that way about coral reefs. These are magnificent, beautiful places. And they do not get enough attention in the national conservation discussion. And we're hoping to help change that narrative, and deliver a hero for every coastline.
Well, I love this. This is something that I've been behind for a while now, and I'm really glad both of you were able to come on to the podcast and be able to talk about this. I think this will be the first of many conversations we have about nearshore conservation and highlighting leaders, highlighting these coastal champions, these community champions, and help others and inspire others to do the same. Like you said, every community has one. It's just a matter of providing them with the resources to get them to get to the level that they need to get, and to be able to get to the results that they want and their community wants. So I want to thank both Alia and Angelo for coming on the podcast, sharing this report. We'll link to the report in the show notes and other resources that you might have. And then we want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast again. And Alia, we'd love to have you back on to be able to discuss more about this nearshore frameworks and conservation. And Angelo, of course, you're always welcome to come back on. And I want to thank you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Alia and Angelo, for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to have you on to be able to talk about nearshore conservation, something that has been always near and dear to me. I always found that when you're living along the coast, somebody told me this a while ago, and I always go by this. When you live along the coastline, you want to look out onto a lake, onto a river, onto an ocean, and you want to say, this looks pretty cool. You don't want to see green water. You don't have to smell nastiness in the water. You want to see intact and natural areas, not all just concrete barriers and seawalls and things like that. You want to see natural areas. And I think we are getting to that point now where the focus starts to go on to nearshore conservation. I really thought it was interesting how the conversation really started from the evolution of the different focuses of conservation, as from like 70s and 80s when Angelo and I were young kids in the 80s, and then seeing how that's evolved over time and even to now, from 30 by 30 to nearshore and justice and equity within conservation and that focus. And I think even doing this type of conservation, no matter what happens in different countries and how different government administrations change their ways and change the way they see things, but also being able to work with ocean heroes, ocean communities, and just any type of coastal community to be able to champion the idea and support and lead the idea of coastal conservation. So I just thought it was a really good interview and a really good topic to discuss, something that we'll be discussing a lot more in the future. I'd love to hear your thoughts though on it. Let us know in the comments below if you're watching this on YouTube, or you can DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. On Instagram, it's at How to Protect the Ocean, or you can go to speakupforblue.com/contact and just fill out the form. Let me know how you feel. It goes right to my inbox and I'll answer you as soon as I can. Again, thank you to Alia and thank you to Angela for coming on the podcast and sharing this knowledge with us. Love to have you back on in the future to talk more about nearshore conservation as well as other types of conservation. And I want to thank you, the audience, for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, from the True North Strong and Free. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.